My name is Lillian Johnson. I am 32 years old. For the last 72 months, I have wired my parents $3,500 on the first of every single month. That is $252,000. I kept the receipts. On my wedding day, the one afternoon, I asked them to witness my life. They left their front row seats empty. They took my money on Tuesday and ghosted my wedding on Saturday. I stepped out of the chapel, made a phone call that lasted 1 minute and 48 seconds, and severed the financial artery that kept them breathing. Before I tell you what happened when the first check bounced, welcome back to Revenge Order, the channel where the bank always wins. Take a moment to subscribe, drop your age and your state in the comments so I know who is listening. Now let me take you to the gravel parking lot outside a chapel in Eureka Springs. It was exactly 2:03 p.m. on a Saturday. The string quartet had already shifted into the opening notes of my processional. The heavy oak doors of the chapel stood open, framing the deep green of the Ozark foothills. I stood in the vestibule, clutching a bouquet of white peonies, waiting for the cue to walk down the aisle. Through the archway, I could see my fiancé David. He stood at the altar in a charcoal suit. His knuckles were white where he gripped his own hands. He did not look at me. His eyes kept darting to the left side of the front row. 2 wooden chairs sat there. They bore ivory placards printed in elegant script, Mother of the Bride, Father of the Bride. The chairs were empty. My parents, Brenda and Thomas, simply did not show up. A normal bride might have wept. A normal bride might have crumpled her peonies, smeared her makeup, or sent a bridesmaid scrambling to call them. I did none of those things. I am a supply chain logistics director. My career is built on identifying broken links, calculating deficits, and severing dead weight. The beaded bodice of my gown weighed 8 pounds, pressing into my ribs like woven armor. I took a slow breath, letting the reality settle into my lungs. The money had cleared their joint account 4 days ago. They took the funds. Then they could not be bothered to occupy the seats I reserved for them. My wedding coordinator hovered near my elbow. She held a clipboard against her chest. She whispered, asking if we should hold the music. I shook my head. I turned away from the aisle. I pushed open the heavy side door and stepped out into the humid Arkansas afternoon. Heat wrapped around me instantly. Cicadas hummed a relentless rhythmic drone in the loblolly pines. The gravel parking lot crunched beneath my satin heels. I reached into my small bridle clutch. I bypassed my parents' contact names in my phone. I pulled up a number I knew by heart. I dialed my bank's premier client services line. The automated hold music played through the speaker, a tinny jazz tune that clashed with the thrum of the insects. While the music looped, I stared at the asphalt shimmering in the sun. I thought about the promotions I took just to cover their bills. I thought about the vacations David and I skipped, the dinners out we declined, the worn tires on my car I refused to replace because Thomas claimed he needed knee therapy. I treated my own life as a secondary project. I treated their comfort as my primary directive. In supply chain management, you track every asset. You monitor every shipment to ensure it reaches the destination and serves its intended purpose. I had blindly shipped my life force to Eureka Springs without ever running an audit. That changes now. The emotional ledger was bankrupt. The financial ledger was about to reflect it. A representative named Marcus answered. He asked how he could assist me. I kept my voice steady, stripped of any tremor. I told him I needed to make an immediate, permanent change to my outbound routing. I stood there in the stifling heat and performed the math I had spent years refusing to look at. $3,500 a month. 72 months, $252,000. $250,000 funneled from my salary into their hands. I bought what I thought was survival. I purchased what I thought was family. I instructed Marcus to cancel the recurring wire to the Thomas and Brenda Johnson joint account. I told him to revoke their access to the auxiliary card. I told him to flag any future requests from those names as unauthorized. Marcus typed. The keyboard clicks echoed faintly through the receiver. He asked if I was certain, noting the long history of the transfers. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my life. He confirmed the recurring transfer was terminated and the access was revoked. The call lasted 1 minute and 48 seconds. I slid the phone back into the clutch and snapped it shut. The metal clasp made a sharp, definitive sound. The panic that had gripped my chest just moments before evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I pulled open the side door and walked back into the chapel. The string quartet had looped the intro twice. The coordinator was sweating in the corner. I gave her a curt nod, stepped into the center aisle, and met David's gaze. I walked toward the altar with a spine made of steel. As I reached the front, I handed my peonies to my maid of honor. I took David by the hands. His palms were damp. He leaned in as the officiant arranged his notes. David whispered, asking where they were. I looked him dead in the eye, the scent of the chapel lilies heavy in the air. I told him they were exactly where they chose to be, and we were not going to let it cost us one more second of our lives. I turned off the faucet, and they had no idea they were already dying of thirst. The shutter of the camera clicked, capturing a moment that felt less like a celebration and more like a crime scene. We stood on the manicured lawn behind the chapel. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of the oak trees, casting long shadows across the grass. David stood beside me, his hand wrapped around my waist, his thumb drawing slow circles against the satin of my dress. He squeezed my hand. It was a firm, grounding pressure. He knew something was wrong. He knew the empty seats in the chapel were not a scheduling error or a flat tire on the highway. The photographer, a young man with an energetic smile, lowered his lens. He checked his shot list, attached to a silver clipboard. He called out for the bride's parents to step into the frame. Silence stretched across the lawn. A warm breeze rustled the leaves, but no one stepped forward. My bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances. David shifted his weight, preparing to speak to offer some polite fiction to the photographer. I tightened my grip on his fingers, stopping him. I stared at the empty patch of grass next to me. That empty patch of grass was bought and paid for. Looking at it, the warm Arkansas breeze faded. My mind drifted back to the exact moment I purchased that void. 72 months ago. The sharp, sterile bite of isopropyl alcohol and clinical bleach coated the back of my throat. Harsh fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over everything in the room. It was room 412 at the Regional Medical Center. I was 26 years old. My father, Thomas, lay in the mechanized hospital bed. His right knee was elevated, bound in thick white surgical bandages. The telemetry monitor hummed next to him, tracking his heart rate. But the real performance was not on the screen. It was in his chest. He gripped the thin, scratchy hospital blanket in his fists. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with manufactured terror. He claimed the family hardware store was drowning. The big box competitors had finally choked out his retail margins. He swore he was on the brink of total financial collapse. The knee surgery, he gasped, was the final nail in the coffin. He told me he had a brilliant exit strategy. He was going to transition the retail space into a B2B e-commerce warehouse model, supplying local contractors directly. He handed me mocked-up folders of racking systems and forklift rentals. It sounded like a solid logistical pivot, but he claimed he needed bridging funds. He needed someone to keep the wolves off the porch while he secured the new commercial logistics. My mother, Brenda, sat in the vinyl visitor chair in the corner of the room. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. Brenda possessed a specific brand of weaponized incompetence. She had never balanced a checkbook, never paid a utility bill, and never navigated a crisis without collapsing into a puddle of helplessness. She paraded her inability to function as a badge of honor, relying on the guilt of others to pave her way. And then there was Harper. My younger sister leaned against the doorframe, bathed in the glow of her smartphone screen. Harper was 22 at the time. While our father feigned a cardiac event over his impending bankruptcy, Harper was loudly complaining that the hospital cafeteria did not stock oat milk for her iced latte. She did not look up from her screen. She did not offer a dime from her part-time barista paycheck. Harper was the prize. She was the golden child meant to be displayed, pampered, and shielded from the harsh realities of consequence. I was the utility. When a family needs an ornament, they polish the golden child. When the roof is collapsing, they search for the load-bearing wall. I was the wall. I had always been the wall. I understood the mechanics of survival better than I understood the mechanics of affection. I sat in that sterile room, pulled a pen from my purse, and grabbed a medical intake form. I did the math right there on the back of the paper. The mortgage, the supposed warehouse transition, costs the physical therapy, co-pays, the utility overhead. I calculated the exact deficit, $3,500 a month. I offered the lifeline. I told Thomas I would cover the gap. I told him he could focus on his recovery and the business pivot. I would handle the rest. Thomas wept. He called me a savior. Brenda rushed over to hug me, her perfume thick and suffocating, calling me her angel. Harper finally looked up from her phone, smiled, and went back to scrolling. I sacrificed the remainder of my 20s to honor that hospital room promise. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling transmission that I refused to replace. I rented a cramped, drafty apartment next to a commercial freight train line because the rent was cheap. I missed out on company retirement matching. I declined weekend trips with friends. I climbed the corporate ladder in supply chain logistics, not out of a burning ambition for power, but out of sheer, unadulterated terror. I had to earn promotion after promotion just to ensure the wire transfer would never bounce. I managed my parents' survival with the same ruthless, cold efficiency I applied to routing overseas shipping containers. I kept them afloat. I kept the hardware store dream alive. I kept the roof over their heads. The photographer cleared his throat, snapping me back to the present. He stood on the lawn, his camera lowered, a sympathetic, awkward grimace on his face. He asked softly if we should wait a few more minutes for my parents to arrive. David looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet, fierce loyalty. He was ready to clear the lawn, ready to shield me from the embarrassment. I looked at the photographer. I kept my posture straight, my chin leveled. I told him we were not waiting. I told him the bride's family was not in attendance, and we would proceed with the bridal party portraits. The shutter began to click again. The reception music drifted from the open doors of the banquet hall. I smiled for the lens, but my mind was calculating a new equation. I had spent 6 years funding a man who claimed his heart could not take the stress of a failing business. Yet here he was, entirely capable of skipping his oldest daughter's wedding without a single phone call, text message, or warning. A man facing imminent financial ruin does not ghost his sole investor. A family drowning in medical debt does not toss away the lifeline on a whim. The math of the hospital room no longer matched the reality of the chapel lawn. The numbers were disjointed. In logistics, when the numbers do not balance, it means there is a leak in the supply chain. It means inventory is being diverted. I stood there in my 8-pound beaded gown, smiling for a wedding album my parents would never see. I had purchased their security. I had purchased their peace of mind, or so I believed. The 2-minute phone call in the parking lot had stopped the bleeding, but the wound was still open, and I needed to know exactly what had caused it. I needed to see the ledger. I spent 6 years buying their survival. I was about to find out what I had actually purchased. The reception hall thrummed with the energy of 120 guests. Crystal glasses clinked over the low bass of a jazz cover band. Servers navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays of seared tenderloin and roasted asparagus. David and I navigated the room, thanking cousins, college friends, and colleagues. I smiled until my jaw ached, accepting the congratulations and dodging the inevitable polite inquiries about my parents' absence. I offered a practiced, seamless lie about a sudden illness. It was easier than explaining the hollow cavern in my chest. By 8 o'clock, the noise of the room began to grate against my nerves. The scent of the buttercream cake mixed with the heavy floral arrangements, creating a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. I caught David's eye across the dance floor. He was deep in conversation with his uncle, but he saw the tension in my shoulders. I tapped my watch and pointed toward the hallway. He gave a subtle nod. I slipped out the side door, leaving the celebration behind, and walked down the carpeted corridor toward the bridal suite. The suite was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of a single vanity lamp. Discarded garment bags and stray bobby pins littered the velvet chaise lounge. The contrast between the chaotic joy of the reception and the absolute stillness of this room was jarring. I locked the door behind me and sank onto the cushioned stool in front of the mirror. I stared at my reflection. My hair remained perfectly pinned, the makeup flawless, but my eyes looked dark, hardened by the calculations running relentlessly through my mind. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen remained blank. No missed calls, no texts begging for forgiveness, no frantic explanations from my father about a broken-down car or a sudden medical emergency. My thumb hovered over the screen. I did not want to call them. I did not want the sound of my mother's weaponized tears. I wanted data. I opened Instagram. It was a habit born of corporate vigilance, checking the digital footprint when the physical one vanished. My feed refreshed. At the very top of the screen, a purple ring pulsed around my sister's profile picture. Harper was broadcasting live. I tapped the icon. The screen illuminated with the stark, bright light of a commercial ring lamp. Music pulsed through the phone's speaker, a trendy, upbeat pop track that sounded like a club at midnight. Harper filled the frame. She wore a tailored, cream-colored pantsuit, her blonde hair styled in effortless, expensive waves. She held a sleek microphone attached to her phone, smiling with a blinding, manicured wattage. Behind her, the scene was entirely foreign. It was not a hospital room. It was not the dusty aisles of my father's failing hardware store. It was a sprawling, pristine retail space. Racks of distressed denim, shelves of artisanal candles, and tables piled with overpriced organic skincare lined the walls. A massive neon sign glowed in pink script above a marble checkout counter, Harper's Haven. "Welcome, everyone, to the grand reopening," Harper squealed into the microphone, her voice carrying over the thump of the music. "We have completely renovated the space, brought in an exclusive new line of European imports, and the champagne is flowing." She spun the camera around to showcase the crowd. A dozen well-dressed patrons mingled among the displays, holding delicate flute glasses. And there, right in the center of the frame, stood my parents. Thomas was not clutching his knee in agony. He stood tall, wearing a crisp navy blazer I had never seen before. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and a plate of catered hors d'oeuvres in the other. He laughed loudly at a joke made by a woman inspecting a rack of silk scarves. Brenda stood next to him. She wore a silk emerald dress, her hair freshly blown out. She looked radiant, entirely unburdened by the crushing financial ruin she constantly claimed was suffocating her. As the camera swept past, Brenda caught the lens. She raised her glass, beamed a picture-perfect smile, and blew a kiss to the viewers. I stared at the screen. The air in the bridal suite seemed to thin, pulling tight across my throat. Fayetteville. The geotag at the top of the broadcast clearly read Fayetteville, Arkansas, 2 hours north of my wedding. While I was walking down the aisle, bracing myself against their absence, they were sipping champagne at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. They had chosen a boutique launch over my vows. My eyes drifted to the chat box, scrolling rapidly on the left side of the screen. Amidst the flurry of heart emojis and congratulations from Harper's followers, one comment remained pinned to the very top. The username was Brenda J. Love. "So proud to support my girls' dreams. Family is everything." The word support snagged in my mind like a jagged hook. Support. My father had claimed the hardware store was bankrupt. He claimed he needed bridging funds for a commercial warehouse transition. My mother claimed they were living on canned soup and prayers. Harper worked a part-time retail job and spent her weekends posting vacation photos she claimed were sponsored. A high-end lifestyle boutique in Fayetteville requires capital. It requires a commercial lease in a premium retail district. It requires contractors for renovations, inventory purchases, from European vendors and marketing budgets for neon signs and catered champagne. Harper did not have that kind of capital. Thomas and Brenda allegedly did not have that kind of capital. But I did. The phone vibrated in my palm, a short, sharp buzz that startled me. A text message banner dropped down over Harper's live stream. It was from Great Aunt Clara. Clara was Thomas's aunt, a formidable, unsentimental woman of 82. She resided on a sprawling, heavily wooded estate outside Hot Springs. Clara did not attend weddings, citing a deep aversion to small talk and dry chicken. She was a woman who spoke rarely, but when she did, she wielded information like a scalpel. She had watched the Johnson family dynamics for decades, from behind the rim of a crystal sweet tea glass, her sharp eyes missing absolutely nothing. I tapped the banner opening her message. It contained a single sentence and a web link. Look closer at the boutique's address, Lillian. I clicked the link. It redirected me to the Washington County Commercial Property Records database. The page displayed the parcel information for the retail space currently glowing with neon pink light on my sister's Instagram feed. I scanned the rows of municipal data, square footage, zoning codes, tax assessments. My eyes locked onto the field labeled Leaseholder History. 3 years ago, the commercial lease for that exact storefront was registered to a limited liability corporation. The LLC was named B2B Logistics and Warehousing, the exact name of the fictional enterprise my father claimed he was pivoting his hardware store into, the enterprise I had been funding to keep him out of bankruptcy. 6 months ago, the leaseholder name was legally transferred. The new tenant on the registry was Harper's Haven, LLC. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a violent, terrifying clarity. There was no warehouse. There was no e-commerce transition. The $3,500 a month I wired to their joint account had not gone to saving the family legacy or covering physical therapy bills. My salary had bypassed the hospital and the hardware store entirely. It had been funneled directly into the Golden Child's aesthetic playground. I had purchased the distressed denim. I had bought the neon sign. I was the silent, unwitting angel investor in a retail vanity project while I drove a car with failing brakes and lived next to a freight train. My parents had not simply skipped my wedding. They had skipped my wedding to celebrate the empire they built using my stolen wages. The phone felt hot against my palm. The live stream continued to play in the background, Harper's laughter echoing thinly from the tiny speaker. I closed the app. I stood up from the velvet chaise lounge. The heavy beaded gown no longer felt like a burden. It felt like battle armor. The 2-minute phone call in the parking lot had severed the supply line, but severing the line was no longer enough. In supply chain logistics, when you uncover systemic fraud, you do not just stop the shipments. You execute a full forensic audit. You track every missing asset down to the final decimal point, and you prepare the impact report. I did not want to cry. I did not want to scream. I wanted to see the ledgers. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to track the trajectory of $250,000. I needed my laptop, because numbers don't lie, but my mother certainly did. Monday morning broke over Little Rock with a muted gray light that matched the interior of my apartment. The remnants of a wedding weekend lay scattered across the living room. Unopened gifts wrapped in silver paper sat in the corner next to the garment bag containing my heavy beaded gown. There was no honeymoon. We had originally planned to spend the week driving down to the Gulf Coast, a modest trip, funded by what little margin I possessed after wiring my parents their monthly allowance. David had canceled the coastal rental on Sunday. He did not argue. He did not try to convince me to go. He understood that my focus had shifted entirely. I sat at the small Formica kitchen table. The rhythmic hum of the commuter traffic drifted through the thin window pane, blending with the low drone of my refrigerator. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a sharp white glow across my face. I logged into my primary banking portal. The interface was familiar, a digital terrain I navigated with the same precision I applied to tracking commercial freight. But today, the objective was different. I was not ensuring a shipment of raw materials reached a manufacturing plant. I was tracking the hemorrhage of my own financial life. I navigated to the joint account ledger, the one I had severed in the chapel parking lot. The bank retained the historical data stretching back the full 72 months. I initiated a bulk export of every transaction, every deposit, every withdrawal since the day Thomas sat in that hospital bed and feigned a panic attack. A CSV file downloaded to my desktop. I opened it in my spreadsheet software, confronted by thousands of raw data points. This was my element. This was where I exercised control. I highlighted the top row freezing the header pane and applied a filter to the withdrawal column. I needed to isolate the expenditures. I needed to see exactly how Thomas and Brenda had allocated the $252,000 I had sacrificed to keep them afloat. The rhythmic click of my mouse echoed in the quiet kitchen. Click, highlight, categorize. Click, highlight, verify. My coffee sat untouched in a ceramic mug beside the laptop, a thin film forming over the surface as it turned ice cold. I did not notice the temperature. The numbers commanded my absolute attention. I created a pivot table to sort the expenditures by vendor and category. The software processed the request, aggregating the thousands of line items into a condensed, unforgiving summary. I started with the narrative Thomas had sold me. The physical therapy, the copays, the medical debt that threatened to crush the family. I isolated every payment made to regional hospitals, clinics, and pharmaceutical providers. The total aggregated at the bottom of the column, $14,200. Over 6 years, the actual cost of his medical care was less than 5% of the total funds I provided. The panic attack, the impending bankruptcy narrative, the crushing weight of healthcare costs, all of it was a fabricated stage play to justify the initial extraction. The remaining balance stared back at me, a staggering sum of $237,800, unaccounted for by any legitimate medical necessity. I adjusted the filters, sorting the remaining transactions by highest frequency and total volume. The resulting list painted a picture that was both breathtakingly arrogant and ruthlessly calculating. A recurring monthly charge of $900 appeared near the top. The vendor was listed as Chenal Valley Country Club. For 6 years, while I shopped for groceries with a calculator in my hand and drove a car that vibrated above 60 miles an hour, my parents maintained a premium membership at the most exclusive golf and tennis club in West Little Rock. They dined on prime rib while I ate discount pasta. Further down the ledger, an annual lump sum withdrawal caught my eye. $4,500 paid every April to a marine services company. I ran a quick search on the vendor name. It was a private docking facility on Beaver Lake. They were paying slip fees. Thomas and Brenda did not just maintain a country club membership. They maintained a boat they never mentioned, docked at a lake they supposedly never visited because they were too overwhelmed by financial stress. But the most damning evidence lay in the direct transfers. I sorted the data by recipient name. The screen populated with a long, dense column of outbound wires. The primary beneficiary was not a B2B warehouse supplier. It was not a hardware inventory distributor. It was Harper's Haven, LLC. The transfers were sporadic at first, small injections of capital to cover initial styling consultations and branding packages. But as the boutique grew, so did the extraction. 8 months ago, a massive single transaction dominated the ledger, $40,000. The memo line attached to the transfer simply read Harper Inventory. $40,000 wired in a single afternoon. That sum alone represented nearly a year of my gross salary. It was the exact amount Harper needed to secure the European imports she bragged about on her Instagram live stream. My parents had treated my life savings as a venture capital fund for their favorite daughter. I highlighted the $40,000 row in a brilliant, aggressive red. I continued down the list highlighting the country club dues in red, the marina fees in red, the boutique vendor payments in red. The spreadsheet transformed from a monochrome list of numbers into a vibrant map of exploitation. The operational rage crystallized. The initial shock of the empty wedding chairs had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. Emotional abuse is often nebulous, easy for the abuser to deny or reframe as a misunderstanding. But math is definitive. You cannot gaslight a ledger. You cannot cry your way out of a pivot table. I had the proof. I had the exact coordinates of every stolen dollar. I reviewed the final aggregated totals one last time. The numbers balanced perfectly. The inputs matched the fraudulent outputs. The forensic audit was complete. I navigated to the File menu and selected Export as PDF. I named the document Joint, audit. I named the document Joint Audit Final.pdf and saved it to my desktop. I sat back in my chair. The morning sun had finally broken through the gray clouds, casting a sharp beam of light across the kitchen table. David walked into the room holding 2 fresh cups of coffee. He set one down next to my cold mug and placed a hand on my shoulder. He looked at the screen, taking in the sea of red highlights. He didn't ask what I found. He didn't ask how bad it was. He just squeezed my shoulder. "What's the next step?" he asked softly. I closed the laptop screen. The sharp glow vanished, leaving the kitchen feeling suddenly quiet. I picked up the fresh coffee. The warmth seeped through the ceramic into my cold palms. I took a slow sip. "We wait," I said. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Tomorrow was the first of the month. Tomorrow was the day the automated wire transfer was scheduled to execute. But the instruction I gave Marcus in the chapel parking lot remained securely in the bank's system. The funds would stay in my primary account. The joint ledger would remain static. The spreadsheet balanced perfectly. The only thing left to do was watch them realize the math had changed. Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a scheduled execution. It was the first of the month. For 72 consecutive cycles, this day marked the automated migration of $3,500 from my salary to Thomas and Brenda's joint account. For 6 years, this transfer formed the bedrock of their financial reality, funding the country club dues, the marina fees, and the Golden Child's retail ambitions. But today, the financial pipeline was severed. The digital mechanism remained dormant. The funds sat undisturbed in my primary ledger. I sat in my home office, my laptop open to a supply chain routing dashboard. The cursor blinked rhythmically. I was tracking a shipment of industrial adhesives bound for Memphis, but a significant portion of my cognitive bandwidth was focused on the smartphone sitting face up on the edge of the desk. I knew the exact timeline of their morning routine. Thomas usually reviewed the account balances over his second cup of coffee around 9 o'clock. By 9:15, he would typically execute the outbound transfers to cover the various luxury subscriptions and Harper's vendor payments. I watched the digital clock in the corner of my screen flip to 10 o'clock. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a structural collapse. The expected barrage of angry phone calls, the demands for an explanation regarding the empty wedding chairs, the inevitable confrontation, none of it materialized. At 10:14, my phone vibrated against the desk. A single notification banner slid across the lock screen. It was an alert from the Facebook app. I swiped open the notification. The app loaded, displaying the news feed. At the very top, pinned by the algorithm due to rapid engagement, was a status update from Brenda. Brenda did not attack me. She did not mention the wedding. She did not express remorse for her absence. Instead, she deployed a tactical misdirection, a masterclass in weaponized victimhood, designed to control the narrative before the truth could surface. The status update was written with maximum theatricality. "Friends and family, please pray for us. We are devastated. This morning, Thomas logged into his account to pay for his crucial physical therapy, only to discover that sophisticated cyber criminals have completely hacked our bank. His entire medical fund was drained overnight. We are currently working with fraud investigators, but the stress on his poor heart is unimaginable. Please be vigilant with your own accounts." I stared at the screen, a cold smile forming on my lips. The audacity was breathtaking. Brenda had realized the money was missing. The scheduled checks were bouncing across Eureka Springs and Fayetteville, but instead of confronting the source of the funds, she attempted to fabricate a crime. She was constructing a red herring. She needed an external villain to explain the sudden evaporation of their wealth, a convenient scapegoat to mask the fact that the actual source of their income had simply decided to stop paying the bill. She was building a firewall of sympathy to protect her image from the inevitable fallout. Below her post, the comments were already multiplying. Aunts, uncles, and neighbors flooded the thread with outrage and condolences. Aunt Susan commented that she was calling the local news station to warn the community. Cousin Greg offered to set up a GoFundMe campaign to cover Thomas's fictitious therapy. Brenda was actively marshaling an army of sympathetic relatives, reinforcing the illusion of their fragile, embattled existence. She was laying the groundwork to explain why the country club membership would likely lapse next week. At 10:22, the phone vibrated again. This time, it was a direct text message. "Lillian, call me ASAP. The bank made a massive error with the transfer. Thomas's physical therapy check is going to bounce. We are on hold with fraud prevention now. Call me." The text was a secondary layer of manipulation. She knew exactly why the transfer failed. She knew I controlled the outbound routing. But by framing it as a bank error and a fraud investigation, she was offering me a script to follow. She was extending an opportunity for me to fix the glitch, to quietly reinstate the wire transfer, and save them from the imaginary cybercriminals without ever having to acknowledge her absence at my wedding. She was waiting for my predictable response. She expected me to panic, to call the bank to ensure the money reached its destination, so Thomas wouldn't suffer. That was the established dynamic. That was how the load-bearing wall was trained to function. I picked up the phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the text thread. I did not type a reply. I did not demand an explanation for the empty chairs in the chapel. I did not point out that her cybercriminal narrative was a pathetic lie to cover her own financial insolvency. Any response, even an angry one, would have given her leverage. It would have provided her with the emotional engagement she craved, a platform to deflect, defend, and further entangle me in her manufactured crisis. Instead, I stared at the screen until the small gray text appeared below her message. Read, 10:24 a.m. I left the read receipt active. I wanted her to know I saw the message. I wanted her to see that I consumed her fabricated panic and chose to offer absolutely nothing in return. I placed the phone back on the desk face down. The administrative panic would now begin to metastasize. The red herring might buy her a few hours of sympathy on social media, but it would not clear the bounce checks at the country club. It would not pay the marina fees on Beaver Lake. And most importantly, it would not fund the golden child's aesthetic empire. The silence I offered was not passive. It was an active, aggressive containment strategy. By refusing to engage with her fiction, I forced her to confront the reality of the empty ledger. The structural supports were removed, and I was allowing gravity to do the work. The phone remained silent for the rest of the morning. Brenda was likely refreshing the text thread, watching that tiny gray read status, waiting for the capitulation that was never going to arrive. She had built a stage, gathered an audience, and written a script of victimhood. My mother thought she was controlling the narrative. She didn't realize she was just performing for an empty theater. Tuesday afternoon progressed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sun shifted across my home office, casting sharp angles of light over the supply chain manifests printed on my desk. While Brenda was busy curating her fictional cybercriminal tragedy for the extended relatives on social media, the tangible world was quietly demanding payment. I knew the operational schedule of my sister's retail vanity project. Tuesday was her inventory acquisition day. Fayetteville sits 2 hours north, nestled in the wealthier pockets of the state. I could picture the scene unfolding there with the precision of a tracking algorithm predicting a localized delay. Harper would be standing at the polished concrete counter of her high-end wholesale distributor. She would have a manicured hand resting on a stack of imported European linens or artisanal ceramics. She would be chatting with the vendor, projecting the effortless aura of a successful young entrepreneur. Then she would hand over her sleek metallic business debit card to cover the $5,000 invoice. The vendor would swipe the card, the terminal would process the request, reaching out to the joint account that had served as her private reservoir for years, and the terminal would return a single humiliating word: declined. Harper had never experienced a declined card in her adult life. She was insulated from the friction of actual commerce. When a person is shielded from consequence, the sudden introduction of a boundary feels like an unprovoked attack. She would swipe it again. The machine would return the same result. The vendor would offer a polite, uncomfortable smile, asking for an alternative form of payment. Harper would step out to the sidewalk, her cheeks burning with unfamiliar embarrassment, and she would dial our mother. Brenda, cornered by the immediate reality of a bounced transaction, would not be able to use the cybercriminal lie. Harper needed cash right now, not a fraud investigation. Brenda would have to offer a different narrative to her golden child. At 1:14 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated, shattering the quiet of my office. A barrage of text messages flooded the lock screen in rapid succession. They were not from Brenda. They were from Harper. I picked up the phone. The messages were a chaotic mess of entitlement and rage, typed so fast the autocorrect had failed to catch the errors. Mom says you locked the Fmaley Trust. My vendor just declined me in front of everyone. I need $5,000 cleared right now. Stop throwing a tantrum over a stupid wedding and fix this. I read the messages twice. My eyes snagged on two specific words buried in her frantic typos: family trust. I leaned back in my desk chair. The leather creaked softly. The sheer scale of my parents' deception expanded, revealing a new layer of psychological rot. They had not merely stolen my wages to fund their favorite daughter, they had lied to her about the source of the funding. Thomas and Brenda needed to preserve their image as benevolent, successful patriarchs, admitting to their golden child that they were functionally bankrupt, admitting that her chic lifestyle was being subsidized by the older sister they frequently dismissed, would have destroyed their ego. So they invented a fiction. They told Harper the money flowed from a generational family trust. They framed my involvement as mere administrative oversight. They cast me as the resentful accountant managing a shared pool of wealth rather than the sole laborer filling the well. Harper genuinely believed she was spending old money. She believed she possessed an inherent right to the capital. She thought my refusal to attend her ribbon cutting or answer our mother's texts was just petty sibling jealousy disrupting her rightful inheritance. She did not know she was a parasite. She did not know I was the host. I set the phone down on the desk. I did not feel the sting of her insult regarding my wedding. The phrase, "stupid wedding," was just a symptom of her conditioned ignorance. Instead of anger, I felt a deep clinical satisfaction. Harper had just handed me the scalpel I needed to dissect her false reality. I opened my laptop. The screen woke instantly, displaying the desktop where I had saved the forensic audit earlier that morning. I opened the document titled Joint Account Audit Final. The spreadsheet filled the screen, a dense grid of dates, vendors, and red highlights. I scrolled down to the aggregate summary at the bottom. $252,000. I used the screen capture tool on my computer to isolate that specific cell, capturing the undeniable sum of my 6-year sacrifice. Then I scrolled back up to the line items from 8 months ago. I found the $40,000 wire transfer. The memo line still read Harper Inventory. I took a second screen capture, ensuring the date, the routing, origin, and the destination, LLC, were clearly visible. I opened the photo editing application. I placed the two images side by side. I selected the digital marker tool, choosing a vibrant, unforgiving neon yellow. I drew a thick circle around the $40,000 transfer. I drew another circle around the aggregate total. I saved the combined image to my local drive and synced it to my phone. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. My phone buzzed again. Harper was escalating. "Hello, the vendor is waiting. Unlock the routing numbers." I picked up the device. I opened our text thread. I tapped the attachment icon and selected the newly created image from my photo gallery. The thumbnail loaded into the chat box, a sharp visual representation of my labor and her theft. I pressed send. The image delivered instantly. I watched the screen. I waited for her to open the attachment. I waited for her eyes to scan the routing numbers to recognize the date of her own boutique launch, to trace the origin of the funds back to my specific personal payroll deposits. I waited for the math to dismantle the myth of the family trust. I tapped the text field to compose my reply. I did not use capital letters. I did not use exclamation points. I used the cold surgical precision of a final notice. There is no family trust. There is only my salary. Enjoy the inventory. I hit send. The blue text bubble appeared beneath the image. I kept the screen active, watching the tiny status indicators at the bottom of the chat. The gray text shifted from delivered to read. A moment later, the typing indicator appeared, 3 small dots pulsing in a gray bubble. Harper was attempting to formulate a response. The dots danced on the screen for 5 seconds, then they vanished. 10 seconds passed. The dots reappeared. They pulsed briefly, a visual representation of a mind struggling to process a catastrophic structural failure. Then they vanished again. No message came through. The typing indicator did not return. The silence that followed was heavy-weighted with the sudden crushing gravity of her new reality. In that quiet span of time, Harper's worldview fractured. The protective bubble our parents had constructed around her popped. She was standing on a sidewalk in Fayetteville, holding a declined debit card, realizing the chic boutique behind her was not a monument to her entrepreneurial spirit. It was a monument to her sister's stolen wages. The vendor was still waiting inside for $5,000 she did not possess. The neon sign hanging above her register was plugged into an outlet she could no longer afford to power. I locked my phone and placed it in the center of the desk. The afternoon sun continued its slow crawl across the room. The shipment of adhesives I was tracking on my monitor had safely reached the Memphis depot. The logistics were flawless. Harper thought she was inheriting an empire. She didn't know the empire was just my Tuesday direct deposit. Wednesday morning broke clear and bright. The heavy humidity of the previous days had lifted, replaced by a sharp, cool breeze rolling off the Ozark Plateaus. The silence from Fayetteville remained absolute. Harper had not replied to my message. The shock of the severed funding had paralyzed her operations. But her silence was merely a symptom of the larger disease. The true source of the rot was located 2 hours away, nestled in the historic district of Eureka Springs. I sat at my kitchen table, dressed in a dark blazer and tailored slacks. I finished a cup of black coffee and pulled a specific file folder from my work briefcase. Inside was a printed copy of the commercial property records I had searched the day before. The records confirmed Harper's boutique lease transfer, but they also listed a secondary property registered under Thomas's primary holding company. It was the address of the B2B e-commerce warehouse, the fictional logistics hub my father claimed he was building to save the family legacy from bankruptcy. For 6 years, I had wired $3,500 a month based on the premise that this warehouse was slowly, painfully gaining traction. Thomas sent me regular updates, carefully crafted narratives of supply chain delays, inventory shortages, and brutal overhead costs. He wove a compelling story of a struggling entrepreneur fighting against the tide of corporate consolidation. I believed him because the alternative was too grotesque to consider. I believed him because I was conditioned to view him as a man striving to survive, not a man calculating an extraction. But the spreadsheet had exposed the lie. The money had not gone to a warehouse. It had gone to a country club and a neon sign. I needed to see the physical location. I needed to witness the physical manifestation of the lie. In logistics, data analysis is crucial, but site inspection is definitive. You cannot verify a supply chain without walking the warehouse floor. I left a note for David on the kitchen counter, grabbed my car keys, and drove north. The drive to Eureka Springs took 3.5 hours. The highway wound through the steep, forested hillsides, the changing elevation mirroring the tightening tension in my chest. I drove past the chapel where, just days prior, I had stood in an 8-pound gown and stared at 2 empty chairs. The memory felt distant, overshadowed by the clinical objective of the current mission. I navigated the winding, narrow streets of the historic downtown district. Victorian storefronts and limestone retaining walls lined the road. The address listed on the property records was located on a prominent corner lot just off the main commercial artery. It was a prime piece of real estate, historically valuable and heavily trafficked by tourists. I pulled into a public parking space across the street and turned off the engine. I looked through the windshield at the building. It was not a warehouse. There were no loading docks, no corrugated steel siding, no commercial delivery trucks idling in the alley. It was a thriving, high-end boutique coffee shop. The exterior brickwork had been recently tuck-pointed. Large, pristine plate glass windows offered a clear view of the interior. A sleek, matte black awning stretched over the entrance bearing the name Roasters Ridge in elegant, minimalist typography. A line of customers spilled out the front door, waiting patiently on the sidewalk. Outdoor patio seating was packed with tourists enjoying the crisp morning air. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The rich, complex aroma of artisanal espresso and roasted coffee beans drifted across the street, cutting through the scent of pine and exhaust fumes. I crossed the asphalt and joined the queue of customers moving slowly toward the entrance. I stepped inside. The interior was a masterclass in modern industrial design. Exposed brick walls, reclaimed wood shelving, and polished concrete floors created an atmosphere of effortless sophistication. A massive, gleaming chrome espresso machine anchored the back counter. 3 baristas moved with synchronized efficiency, pulling shots and steaming milk. This was not a struggling enterprise. This was a highly profitable, seamlessly managed commercial operation. I approached the register. The barista, a young woman with a canvas apron and a bright smile, greeted me. She asked for my order. I ordered a standard drip coffee. I handed her a $10 bill. As she processed the transaction and counted my change, I leaned against the polished counter. I kept my voice casual, injecting a tone of mild curiosity into the interaction. "This is a beautiful space," I remarked. "You guys have done an incredible job with the renovations. Do you own the building or just lease the storefront?" The barista handed me my coins and smiled proudly. "Oh, we just lease it. The owners, Sarah and Mark, put a lot of work into the interior design before we opened 2 years ago." 2 years ago. The timeline aligned perfectly. Thomas had shuttered the hardware store entirely, likely liquidating the remaining inventory to cover the initial remodel costs, and immediately secured a commercial tenant. The landlord must be thrilled to have such a successful business in here. I continued, pressing the conversation forward. "A corner lot in this district must command a serious premium." The barista laughed, a short, sharp sound of agreement. "You have no idea. The rent here is brutal. $4,000 a month plus triple net. But the foot traffic makes it worth it." She wiped down the counter with a damp cloth. "The landlord is a local guy, Thomas Johnson. He's pretty strict. He collects the rent promptly on the first of every month. He actually requires a certified cashier's check dropped off at his home address." I picked up my cardboard cup. The heat of the coffee radiated through the sleeve. Promptly on the first, I repeated, my voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "Every single month," she confirmed cheerfully. I thanked her, dropped a tip into the jar, and walked back out onto the sidewalk. I stood in the shadow of the matte black awning. The cool breeze hit my face, but I felt a sudden intense heat rising in my chest. Thomas was not a victim of a changing economy. He was not a desperate man crushed by medical debt and corporate retail competitors. The narrative of his incompetence, the story of the struggling patriarch desperately trying to pivot his legacy, was an elaborate, calculated fiction. He was a financial parasite. He was a highly competent, ruthless extractor. While he sat in that hospital room and hyperventilated about bankruptcy, he was likely already negotiating the commercial lease terms for this corner lot. For 3 years, he had been collecting $4,000 in commercial rent from this coffee shop. And on the first of every month, while he deposited that certified cashier's check from the barista's employers, he watched the automated wire transfer from my salary land in his joint account. $3,500. He was double dipping. He was generating $7,500 in liquid capital every 30 days, entirely untaxed by effort or labor. He used my terror to fund his leisure. He leveraged my sense of duty to subsidize his country club lifestyle and my sister's vanity projects while hoarding the commercial rent for himself. He watched me sacrifice my 20s, watched me live next to a freight train, and never once offered a dime of the rental income to ease my burden. The plot twist was not that he was failing. The plot twist was that he was succeeding wildly and using me as the baseline margin to guarantee his wealth. I walked back to my car. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. I placed the untouched coffee in the cup holder. I looked across the street at the line of customers still waiting to purchase a $5 latte, unknowingly contributing to the commercial rent my father collected with ruthless punctuality. The anger I felt in my apartment while reviewing the spreadsheet was analytical. It was operational rage. The anger I felt now, sitting in the shadow of the coffee shop, was different. It was cold. It was absolute. It was the kind of anger that does not seek an apology. It seeks demolition. I started the engine. I pulled away from the curb, leaving the historic district behind. The drive ahead was clear. I was not returning to Little Rock. I was driving south toward Hot Springs. I needed tactical guidance. I needed the missing pieces of the puzzle that only a generational observer could provide. My father wasn't drowning. He was lounging on a life raft I had bought, charging rent to other passengers. The drive from Eureka Springs to Hot Springs took 3 hours. The highway carved through the Ouachita Mountains, a landscape of dense timber and deep thermal springs that steamed in the cool afternoon air. I drove with the radio off. The silence in the car was heavy, filled only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the relentless processing of the data I had just uncovered. Thomas was collecting $4,000 in commercial rent. Brenda was weaponizing cybercriminal narratives on social media. Harper was standing in a high-end boutique with a declined debit card. The facade of the Johnson family was rapidly disintegrating, exposing the structural rot beneath. I needed an ally. I needed someone who operated outside the immediate blast radius of Brenda's emotional manipulation. I needed Great Aunt Clara. Clara's estate was located just outside the city limits, positioned at the end of a long, unpaved driveway flanked by ancient, towering pine trees. The house was a sprawling, single-story ranch built in the late 1960s, constructed of dark brick and large glass panes. It was a fortress of quiet wealth, maintained with an almost severe level of discipline. I parked the car on the circular gravel pad and walked to the front door. I did not knock. Clara despised the formality of front doors. I walked around to the side patio where the scent of old pine needles mixed with the sharp, clean odor of lemon polish emanating from the open screen door. Clara sat at a wrought iron patio table, a newspaper folded neatly beside her. She wore a tailored linen blouse and dark slacks. Her silver hair was cropped short, framing a face defined by sharp cheekbones and eyes that had never once been clouded by sentimentality. She was 82 years old, but her posture was as rigid as a steel beam. She looked up from her tea glass as I approached. She did not offer a hug. She did not offer empty condolences regarding the empty chairs at my wedding. Clara dealt exclusively in facts. "You found the coffee shop," she stated. It was not a question. I pulled out an iron chair and sat across from her. $4,000 a month in commercial rent, plus triple net, while I was wiring him $3,500 on the first of every month. Clara nodded slowly. She reached for a crystal pitcher resting on a silver tray in the center of the table. Her age-spotted hands gripped the handle. The pour was perfectly steady, not a single drop of the dark amber liquid spilled onto the glass tabletop. She slid the glass toward me. "Your father is a deeply uncreative man," Clara said, her voice a dry rasp that carried clearly in the quiet afternoon. "He lacks the imagination to build wealth, so he resorts to extracting it. He learned early on that it is far easier to exploit competence than to develop it. You were competent. Brenda was compliant. Harper was a distraction." I picked up the cold glass. The condensation chilled my palm. "You knew about the commercial lease. You sent me the link to the property records." "I have been monitoring Thomas's financial maneuverings since your grandfather passed," Clara replied, folding her hands in her lap. "When the hardware store began losing margin, I anticipated a collapse. I did not anticipate him leveraging your salary to subsidize a country club membership and a retail vanity project for your sister. I assumed you were aware of the arrangement." "I was told the hardware store was pivoting to a B2B warehouse model. I was told he was on the brink of bankruptcy due to medical debt." Clara let out a short, humorless laugh. "Medical debt. Thomas Johnson has not paid a legitimate medical bill in a decade. He carries premium supplemental insurance through Brenda's previous employer retirement package. He pays zero out of pocket." I set the glass down. The final pillar of his fabricated crisis crumbled. The entire foundation of his extraction was built on a series of calculated, demonstrable lies. "I stopped the transfers," I said. "I called the bank from the chapel parking lot. The account is severed. Harper's card was declined this afternoon. Brenda is currently on Facebook claiming cybercriminals hacked the medical fund." Clara's eyes sharpened. A glint of genuine approval flashed across her features. "Good. You severed the supply line, but severing the supply line does not recover the stolen assets. It merely halts the bleeding. You must understand, Lillian Thomas will not simply accept the loss of revenue. He views your salary as his rightful pension. He will attempt to compel you to reinstate the transfers. He will use guilt, he will use intimidation, and he will use the family home as leverage." "The family home," I repeated. "The house in Little Rock. He holds the deed." Clara leaned forward. The distance between us closed. The scent of lemon polish grew stronger. "That brings us to the actual reason I required you to drive down here today. You have audited the bank statements. You have verified the commercial lease, but you have not verified the primary asset." She reached into the pocket of her linen blouse and withdrew a small brass key. She set it on the table between us. "Your grandmother, my sister Margaret, was a woman who understood the destructive nature of Thomas's entitlement long before I did. Margaret observed how Thomas treated you. She observed how he favored Harper. She knew that if Thomas was given unrestricted control of the family estate, he would inevitably squander it to maintain his own comfort, leaving you entirely unprotected. I stared at the brass key. The implications of Clara's words began to form a terrifying new geometry in my mind. Margaret fell ill 12 years ago, Clara continued, her voice dropping to a low, measured cadence. Before her cognitive decline became severe, she engaged a private attorney. She executed a series of legal maneuvers designed to ensure Thomas could not liquidate the primary residence. She structured a safeguard, but she knew Thomas would attempt to destroy the documentation if he discovered it. She needed a secure location, a physical artifact that Brenda would never bother to inspect and Harper would never value. Clara pointed a long, manicured finger at me. Go to your parents' house, the one in Little Rock. Thomas and Brenda are currently in Fayetteville attempting to manage Harper's retail meltdown. The house is empty. She slid the brass key across the glass table. It stopped inches from my hand. Use this key to access the cedar chest in the guest bedroom closet. Margaret's quilt is stored inside. The wedding ring pattern. She hand-stitched it herself. Clara's gaze locked onto mine, unblinking and absolute. Get your grandmother's quilt. Feel the bottom left square. You will find the safeguard. I picked up the key. The metal was cold and heavy. The narrative shifted abruptly. The conflict was no longer isolated to stolen wages and luxury spending. The extraction was generational. Thomas had not merely exploited my competence, he had actively suppressed a legal mandate designed to protect me. He had hoarded an asset that did not belong to him. The quilt was not a sentimental keepsake. It was a tactical objective. It was Chekhov's gun loaded and waiting in a cedar chest for over a decade. What is inside the square, Clara? I asked. Clara leaned back in her chair. She picked up her tea glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The instrument of your father's eviction. Retrieve the quilt, Lillian. We will discuss the deployment of the asset once you have secured it. I stood up. I placed the brass key in my pocket. The anger that had propelled me from Eureka Springs had refined into a sharp, lethal focus. I had the financial data. I had the commercial records. Now I possessed the coordinates of the final, devastating piece of evidence. I thanked Clara and walked back to my car. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the driveway. My father hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my grandmother's dying wish, and I was going to his house to take it back. The drive from Hot Springs to Little Rock took 50 minutes. The sun was dropping fast, painting the Arkansas sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. The brass key felt heavy in my pocket, a physical anchor against the rising tide of adrenaline. Clara had assured me the house would be empty. Thomas and Brenda were supposed to be in Fayetteville, managing the fallout of Harper's declined debit card and the sudden lack of inventory capital. I expected a quiet extraction. I expected to unlock the door, retrieve the quilt from the cedar chest, and leave before the dust settled. I turned onto their street. The neighborhood was a quiet, established enclave of brick ranches and mature oak trees. It was the kind of neighborhood that projected stability and generational wealth, the kind of neighborhood my parents had no business residing in, given their actual financial reality. I pulled into the long paved driveway and shifted the car into park. The house was not empty. A silver luxury SUV was parked awkwardly near the garage, angled as if it had arrived in a hurry. The engine block ticked softly, radiating heat. They were home. The Fayetteville crisis must have escalated, forcing them to retreat to their primary stronghold to strategize. I cut the engine. I sat in the silence of the cabin, the brass key pressing against my thigh. The tactical advantage of an empty house was gone. The extraction would not be quiet. It would be a direct confrontation. I opened the car door and stepped onto the driveway. The cool evening air was sharp against my face. Before I reached the front steps, the heavy oak door swung open. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, followed closely by Brenda. Thomas looked exactly as he had in the boutique coffee shop photographs, exuding an aura of robust, aggressive health. He was not clutching his knee. He was not pale or struggling for breath. He stood tall, shoulders squared, projecting the manufactured authority he had wielded over me for 3 decades. He was wearing a brand new, crisp Orvis fishing shirt. The pale blue fabric was flawless, the intricate stitching around the pockets pristine. It was a $400 shirt, a shirt purchased with the capital I wired him on Tuesday, a shirt he bought while ignoring the wedding I had planned for a year. Brenda hovered behind him, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She was nervously twisting her diamond wedding band, rotating the stones in a frantic, repetitive motion. The confident, radiant woman from Harper's Instagram livestream had vanished, replaced by the familiar, anxious martyr. Lillian Thomas barked, his voice booming across the quiet driveway. He marched down the front steps, closing the distance between us. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how the wedding went. He immediately launched into the offensive, attempting to seize control of the interaction before I could speak. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" he demanded, stopping 3 feet from me. His face was flushed, a vein pulsing slightly at his temple. "Harper is in tears. Her vendors are threatening collections. You locked the trust account without a single word of warning. You are jeopardizing this entire family's financial security." The sheer audacity of the statement was breathtaking. He was framing my refusal to continue the extortion as an act of familial sabotage. He was deploying the patriarch routine, attempting to intimidate me into compliance through sheer volume and righteous anger. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked directly at the $400 Orvis shirt. "There is no trust account, Thomas," I said. My voice was low, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. I did not call him Dad. The title was a privilege he had forfeited. "There is only my payroll deposit, and my payroll deposit is no longer available to subsidize your country club membership." Thomas's jaw tightened. The mention of the country club breached his defenses. The facade of the struggling, bankrupt hardware store owner cracked, revealing the calculating extractor beneath. He realized I possessed the data. He realized the spreadsheet was no longer a secret. But a narcissist cornered by facts does not apologize. They escalate. "You ungrateful, selfish girl," Thomas snarled, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical size to dominate the space. "I built the foundation you stand on. I paid for the roof over your head. You owe this family your support. You made a commitment in that hospital room, and now you are ruining my retirement because of some petty grudge over a wedding schedule?" He was doubling down on the intimidation. He believed the old conditioning would hold. He believed if he yelled loud enough, the load-bearing wall would assume its designated position and accept the weight. Brenda stepped off the porch, deploying her specialized weaponry. She moved to flank him, her face a mask of manufactured agony. "Lillian, how can you be so cruel?" Brenda cried, her voice trembling with the precise frequency of a professional victim. The diamond ring flashed as she wrung her hands. "After everything we sacrificed for you, we fed you, we clothed you, we made sure you had every opportunity to succeed. And this is how you repay us? By cutting off your sick father's medical funds?" The medical funds lie again. Even now, with the truth exposed, she clung to the script. She was weaponizing basic parental obligations, attempting to convert the standard provision of food and clothing during my childhood into a lifelong, inescapable debt. I looked at Brenda. I observed the frantic twisting of the ring. I observed the hollow, performative tears. "You fed me in 1998, Brenda," I replied, the coldness in my voice slicing through her hysteria like a scalpel. "I fed you for the last 72 months. I paid for the Orvis shirt Thomas is currently wearing. I paid for the neon sign hanging in Harper's boutique. I paid the commercial rent you hoarded from the coffee shop in Eureka Springs." Both of them froze. The mention of the coffee shop was a tactical strike. The knowledge that I had uncovered his double-dipping operation paralyzed Thomas. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. The patriarch routine shattered instantly when confronted with undeniable forensic proof of his fraud. I did not wait for them to recover. I bypassed Thomas, stepping around his frozen form, and walked up the porch steps. "Where are you going?" Thomas shouted, his voice suddenly thinner, stripped of its previous authority. "I am retrieving my grandmother's quilt," I stated, pulling open the front door, "and then I am leaving." I moved swiftly through the foyer, ignoring the familiar scent of Brenda's potpourri. I navigated to the guest bedroom. The house felt smaller than I remembered, diminished by the exposure of the lies that sustained it. I opened the closet door. The cedar chest sat on the floor exactly where Clara said it would be. I inserted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. I opened the lid. The scent of cedar filled the small space. Resting on top of a stack of folded blankets was the quilt. The wedding ring pattern was meticulously hand-stitched, the faded colors a stark contrast to the modern, sterile environment of the house. I lifted the quilt. It was heavy, substantial. I did not bother to inspect the bottom left square. That was a task for the security of my own apartment. I simply folded the heavy fabric over my arm, closed the cedar chest, and walked back out to the driveway. Thomas and Brenda were still standing on the concrete, immobilized by the sudden collapse of their narrative. They had attempted a full frontal assault. They had deployed volume, guilt, and intimidation. They had fired every weapon in their arsenal, and every single round had bounced off the armor. I walked past them without a word. I opened the door to my car, placed the quilt carefully on the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. I started the engine. Brenda took a hesitant step forward, her hand reaching out toward the car. "Lillian, please, you can't just leave. We need to talk about the mortgage. The payment is due next week." I rolled down the window just enough to be heard. "Talk to your commercial tenant in Eureka Springs," I said. I shifted the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway. I left them standing on the concrete, two exposed frauds illuminated by the harsh glare of my headlights. They thought they could scream me into submission, but you cannot scream at a closed vault. The quilt sat on the passenger seat, a silent passenger during the dark drive back to Little Rock. The confrontation in the driveway had been a decisive tactical victory. I had deployed the information regarding the Eureka Springs coffee shop neutralizing Thomas's intimidation. I had rejected Brenda's weaponized guilt. I had secured the primary objective, but I knew the silence following the driveway ambush would not last. Narcissists do not surrender when their private manipulations fail. They seek a public arena. They recruit an audience. They launch a smear campaign to destroy the credibility of the person who exposed them. The retaliation began before I even reached the city limits. My phone resting in the center console began a relentless, rhythmic vibration. It was not a single notification, it was a cascade. Text messages, missed call alerts, and social media notifications flooded the screen in a rapid, unbroken stream. The digital assault was synchronized and overwhelming. I did not touch the phone. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, focusing on the yellow lines of the highway cutting through the darkness. The vibration against the plastic console was a physical manifestation of Brenda's escalating panic. I arrived at my apartment, parked the car, and carried the heavy quilt upstairs. David was waiting in the living room. He saw my face, saw the tension radiating from my shoulders, and immediately took the quilt from my arms. He set it gently on the sofa. "They were home," I stated, pulling off my coat. Thomas tried to scream his way out of it. Brenda tried the martyr routine I mentioned the coffee shop. They froze. I took the quilt and left. David nodded. He picked up my phone, which was still vibrating incessantly on the kitchen counter. He tapped the screen to wake it. His expression darkened. "Brenda went nuclear," he said quietly, handing the device to me. I unlocked the phone. The notification center was choked with alerts from the extended family group chat, private direct messages from distant cousins, and dozens of tags on a new Facebook post. I opened the Facebook application. Brenda had escalated her previous cybercriminal narrative, pivoting to a direct, vicious character assassination. The post was a long, meticulously crafted essay of absolute fiction. I am heartbroken to write this, but the truth must be told. Our family is being torn apart. Lillian suffered a massive bridezilla meltdown over a minor scheduling misunderstanding regarding her wedding. Instead of communicating like an adult, she has chosen to punish us in the most vindictive way imaginable. She has completely abandoned her sick father in his hour of need, freezing the accounts we rely on for his physical therapy. After everything we sacrificed to give her a good life, she has turned her back on us over a petty grudge. Please pray for Thomas's heart. The stress is killing him. Below the post, the digital mob had already assembled. The comment section was a horrifying display of misplaced outrage and unquestioning loyalty to the matriarch. Aunt Susan, who had not spoken to me in 3 years, left a lengthy comment condemning my selfishness. Cousin Greg, the one who offered to set up the GoFundMe, posted a string of angry emojis calling my actions unforgivable. The group chat notifications mirrored the public condemnation. Shame on you, Lillian. Family is family. How can you do this to your sick father? You need to apologize and fix this immediately. The screen was a wall of praying hands emojis and jagged accusatory text. The pressure was suffocating. This was the trap Brenda had designed. She was using the collective weight of the extended family to isolate me, to shame me, to force me into an emotional defense. She wanted me to log online to argue in the comment section, to desperately try and explain the spreadsheets and the coffee shop to an audience that was already primed to view me as the villain. If I engaged, I lost. Arguing with a smear campaign only validates the premise of the attack. It pulls the victim into the mud, elevating the abuser's lie to the status of a debate. "Don't reply," David said, his voice firm. He placed a hand over mine, gently pushing the phone down against the counter. "It's a bait." "I know," I replied. The air in the apartment felt thin, the digital hatred seeping through the screen and contaminating the physical space. The isolation was profound. For 6 years I had been the silent architect of their survival, and in a single evening, Brenda had successfully painted me as their executioner. I turned away from the phone. The social shame was heavy, but it was irrelevant to the objective. The smear campaign was a desperate, noisy distraction. The true center of gravity was sitting on my sofa. I walked into the living room and approached the quilt. The faded wedding ring pattern looked fragile under the harsh glare of the apartment lighting. I traced my fingers along the edge of the heavy fabric. I moved to the bottom left corner, exactly as Clara had instructed. The corner felt different. The batting inside the quilt was usually soft and yielding, but in this specific square, there was a rigid, flat resistance beneath the fabric. It felt like thick cardstock. I walked to the kitchen drawer and retrieved a small pair of utility scissors. David stood beside the sofa, watching silently as I returned. I knelt beside the quilt. I inserted the tip of the scissors into the seam at the very edge of the bottom left square. I snipped the heavy thread carefully, opening a 4-inch gap in the fabric. I reached 2 fingers inside the opening. My fingers brushed against smooth paper. I gripped the edge and slowly pulled it out. It was a folded document enclosed in a protective, clear plastic sleeve. The paper was brittle and yellowed with age, emitting a faint, dusty odor of old archives. I slid the document out of the sleeve and unfolded it carefully on the coffee table. It was a legal deed stamped with the official seal of the Pulaski County Clerk's Office. The date at the top of the page was clear, October 14th, 1990. I scanned the dense legal topography. The document was a generational trust transfer. Margaret Johnson, my grandmother, was the grantor. I traced the line detailing the property address. It was the exact address of the brick ranch house in Little Rock, the house Thomas and Brenda currently occupied, the house Thomas had fiercely defended as his own during the driveway ambush. I moved down to the grantee section. The name listed was not Thomas Johnson. The name listed as the sole trustee and legal owner of the property was Clara Hayes. Great Aunt Clara. The final paragraph of the deed outlined the specific stipulations of the trust. Clara was granted full administrative authority over the property. Thomas was permitted to reside in the house rent-free, provided he maintained the family hardware store as an operational solvent business. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Thomas never owned the house. He was a conditional tenant. The patriarch who screamed at me from his front porch, claiming he built the foundation and owned the roof, was living in a property owned entirely by his aunt, and he had violated the core condition of the trust 3 years ago when he secretly shuttered the hardware store to collect commercial rent from a coffee shop. The power dynamic shifted instantly. The social shame emanating from my phone became utterly meaningless. Brenda's Facebook essay, the praying hands emojis, the outrage of Aunt Susan, none of it mattered. Social shaming is a weapon used by people who lack structural power. I possessed the structural power. I held the legal deed that proved their entire existence was a conditional arrangement they had already breached. I looked up at David. The isolation was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying supremacy. "He doesn't own the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Clara owns it, and he broke the terms of the lease 3 years ago." David stared at the yellowed paper. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "He threatened to kick you off his property? It isn't his property?" The digital mob was still raging on my phone in the kitchen. Brenda was busy orchestrating my public execution, rallying the relatives for an upcoming holiday showdown. November was approaching. Thanksgiving was the traditional stage for family interventions, the perfect arena for Brenda to force a tearful public surrender. She was currently drafting the invitations for a Thanksgiving dinner designed to break me. She was preparing the audience. I carefully folded the 1990 trust deed and slid it back into the plastic sleeve. I placed it securely inside my briefcase, right next to the forensic audit spreadsheets and the photographs of the Eureka Springs coffee shop. My parents invited me to Thanksgiving to publicly execute my reputation. They didn't know I was bringing the guillotine. The weeks following the discovery of the 1990 deed passed in a state of tense, heavily guarded silence. The 1st of November arrived. The automated wire transfer failed for the second consecutive month. The financial pressure on Thomas and Brenda was rapidly escalating from administrative discomfort to structural collapse. Harper's Fayetteville boutique had gone completely dark on social media. The neon sign was unplugged, and the European imports remained stalled in unpaid shipping containers. The cybercriminal narrative Brenda had so carefully constructed online could no longer mask the absolute lack of liquidity. They needed cash. More importantly, they needed the primary revenue stream reinstated before the country club revoked their membership and the reality of their insolvency became public knowledge. They needed me to submit. The trap was set on the second Tuesday of November. A notification from the extended family group chat appeared on my phone. The chat had been largely silent since the initial barrage of hate following Brenda's smear campaign. I opened the application. Brenda had posted a lengthy, carefully worded message. "Family this year has brought unexpected challenges and painful misunderstandings. But Thanksgiving is a time for healing and grace. Thomas and I are hosting dinner at our home. We want everyone there. Lillian, we are extending a special invitation to you and David. It is time to put this petty bridezilla grudge behind us, ask for forgiveness, and remember our obligations to this family. We look forward to a beautiful forgiveness dinner." The message was a masterclass in coercive control. She publicly framed my absence and the cessation of funds as a petty grudge, minimizing the 6 years of financial extraction to a minor emotional tantrum. She positioned herself as the benevolent matriarch, graciously offering me a path back into the fold. The use of the phrase, "obligations to this family," was a thinly veiled demand for the resumption of the $3,500 monthly wire. She was inviting me to a public tribunal. She had stacked the jury with 18 relatives who had already consumed her Facebook essay and judged me guilty. She anticipated that the sheer volume of familial pressure, combined with the holiday setting, would overwhelm my resolve. She expected me to arrive, weep, apologize for the financial disruption, and promise to fix the imaginary bank error. I did not reply to the group chat. I typed a direct 2-word text message to Brenda. "Will attend." I set the phone down. The trap was locked. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I took an extended lunch break from the logistics firm. I drove to a commercial print shop in downtown Little Rock. The digital PDF of the forensic audit the document that tracked the exact trajectory of $237,800 in stolen funds needed a physical form. You cannot hand a digital file to an angry uncle. You cannot slam a PDF onto a dining room table. I approached the counter and handed the clerk a flash drive. I requested 10 copies of the document. I specified the materials with exact precision. I did not want flimsy standard printer paper. I requested heavy, high-gloss stock paper. I wanted the pages to possess a physical weight, a tactile authority that commanded attention. I ordered them spiral-bound, with thick, clear acrylic covers and solid black backing. When the clerk handed me the finished product an hour later, the 10 booklets felt substantial in my hands. They did not look like personal financial records. They looked like corporate indictments. I placed the 10 bound spreadsheets into a sturdy canvas tote bag, alongside the manila envelope containing Clara's 1990 trust deed. Thanksgiving Thursday arrived with a bitter, biting chill. The sky was a flat slate gray, threatening freezing rain. David and I drove to the brick ranch house in silence. He wore a dark suit. I wore a structured navy dress. We did not dress for a holiday celebration. We dressed for an executive board meeting. We pulled into the long driveway. The silver luxury SUV was parked in its usual spot. Half a dozen other vehicles lined the curb, indicating the arrival of the extended family jury. I carried the canvas tote bag over my shoulder. The heavy, high-gloss paper weighed against my side, a physical reminder of the artillery I possessed. David opened the front door. We stepped into the foyer. The immediate sensory input was overwhelmingly normal. The rich, savory aroma of roasted turkey and sage stuffing filled the air thick and comforting. The television in the den murmured with the low, continuous drone of a football game. The clinking of silverware and the hum of conversation drifted from the dining room. But beneath the smell of the roasted turkey, the tension in the house was palpable. The air felt thick, charged with the nervous energy of an audience waiting for an execution. We walked into the living room. 18 people were gathered in the space. Aunt Susan sat rigid on the floral sofa, her lips pursed tightly. Cousin Greg stood near the fireplace, nursing a beer and glaring at me. Harper sat rigidly in an armchair, her designer nails chipped her face pale and devoid of her usual Instagram radiance. She looked terrified. The sudden lack of inventory capital had clearly fractured her reality. Thomas stood near the hallway holding a glass of bourbon. He wore a different, equally expensive button-down shirt. He did not step forward to greet us. He merely stared, his posture projecting aggressive dominance. Brenda emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a decorative apron. The moment she saw me, she assumed her position center stage. She stopped in the middle of the room, ensuring every relative had a clear view of the interaction. She did not offer a hug. She offered a performance. Lillian Brenda said, her voice pitched loud enough to silence the room. "You came! I prayed you would find it in your heart to attend. I hope you are prepared to discuss how we move forward as a family." The room went entirely silent. 18 pairs of eyes locked onto me. This was the moment Brenda had orchestrated. The pressure was designed to crush me instantly, to force an immediate concession before we even reached the dinner table. I did not break eye contact. I did not lower my head. I gripped the strap of the canvas tote bag. "We are here for dinner, Brenda," I replied, my voice steady, projecting across the silent room. "The discussion will happen at the table." I walked past her, ignoring the collective gasp from Aunt Susan, and moved directly into the dining room. The table was set with Brenda's finest china, the crystal gleaming under the chandelier. The stage was perfectly arranged. They set the table for a prodigal daughter's apology. I brought the receipts. The 18 relatives took their seats around the massive extended dining table. The scraping of wooden chair legs against the hardwood floor sounded abnormally loud in the strained silence. David sat to my right. Thomas anchored the head of the table, his bourbon glass replaced by a crystal goblet of water, his posture rigid. Brenda sat opposite him at the foot, the decorative apron discarded, ready to conduct the symphony of my humiliation. Platters of turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, and steaming green bean casseroles were passed with stiff, robotic movements. No one spoke. The usual holiday banter was entirely absent. Aunt Susan glared at me from across the cranberry sauce. Cousin Greg aggressively buttered a roll. The jury was seated, the evidence of my supposed cruelty already firmly established in their minds via Facebook. Brenda waited until every plate was full. She picked up her water goblet and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-pitched chime cut through the tension. "Before we begin," Brenda announced, her voice adopting the trembling, vulnerable frequency she had perfected over decades, "I want to offer a toast. This year has tested our family deeply. We have faced the terrifying specter of Thomas's failing health, and we have endured the painful, agonizing sting of abandonment." She paused, letting the word abandonment hang in the air. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were already brimming with manufactured tears. "But today is about healing," she continued, her voice rising slightly for dramatic effect. "Today is about remembering that no grudge, no matter how petty, is more important than family. We are here to offer grace. We are here to accept an apology and to pray that the financial security we desperately rely on is restored, so Thomas can finally afford the medical care he needs." Aunt Susan murmured an audible amen. Greg nodded sternly. The trap was sprung. The demand for submission was public framed as an act of divine forgiveness. I did not touch my water glass. I did not yell. I did not attempt to defend myself against the emotional barrage. I reached down to the canvas tote bag resting against the leg of my chair. I pulled out the 10 spiral-bound booklets. The thick acrylic covers clicked against one another as I set the stack on the table. The heavy, high-gloss stock paper gave the documents a formidable, undeniable weight. I slid the top booklet toward Uncle Rick, Brenda's older brother, who sat to my left. I slid the next one toward Aunt Susan. I continued passing the bound spreadsheets down both sides of the table until the stack was depleted. "What is this?" Thomas demanded from the head of the table, his voice losing its projected authority, cracking slightly with the first edge of genuine panic. He recognized the red highlights visible through the clear acrylic covers. "This is the healing you requested, Brenda," I stated, my voice projected clearly, cold and flat. I remained seated. I did not need to stand to command the room. "You invited everyone here to discuss my financial obligations to this family. You posted on social media that I abandoned Thomas, leaving him destitute and unable to afford his physical therapy due to a massive bridezilla meltdown." I looked at Uncle Rick. He was staring at the cover of the document. "Open it, Rick." Page 1. Uncle Rick frowned, reaching into his breast pocket and retrieving a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He slipped them onto his nose and flipped the acrylic cover open. The sudden rustle of heavy paper turning echoed around the room as multiple relatives followed his lead. For 72 months, I began my tone adopting the clinical precision of a corporate audit presentation. I wired $3,500 to Thomas and Brenda's joint account on the 1st of every month. The total extraction over 6 years was $252,000. A sharp intake of breath came from Aunt Susan. She stared at the aggregate total printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the first page. "I was told the funds were bridging capital," I continued, "necessary to save the family hardware store from bankruptcy and cover Thomas's crushing medical debt." I gestured to the open booklets. "Turn to page 2. I audited every transaction from that joint account. The total legitimate medical expenditure over 6 years was $14,200. Thomas is fully covered by Brenda's supplemental retirement insurance. The medical bankruptcy was a complete fabrication." The temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of roasted turkey was entirely overpowered by the sudden, suffocating realization that the patriarch's narrative was a lie. "Turn to page 3, I instructed. The sound of pages turning was synchronized now. The jury was no longer looking at me. They were looking at the data. The remaining $237,800 did not go toward a struggling B2B warehouse transition. I stated, the operational rage finally finding its target. It went toward luxury consumption. Look at the rows highlighted in red. $900 a month to the Chenal Valley Country Club, $4,500 annually for a private marina slip on Beaver Lake. "This is a violation of privacy," Brenda shrieked, slamming her hands flat on the table. The china rattled. "You hacked our accounts. These are fabricated lies. Thomas, do something." Thomas sat frozen. The vein in his temple throbbed violently. He could not refute the ledger. The bank routing numbers were printed clearly next to every transaction. I ignored her outburst. I kept my gaze locked on the relatives holding the booklets. "It gets worse," I said, my voice cutting through Brenda's rising hysteria. Turn to page 4. The Eureka Springs commercial property. Uncle Rick adjusted his glasses, his face draining of color. "Thomas closed the hardware store 3 years ago. I explained the facts, striking like hammer blows against the silence. He leased the building to a highly profitable boutique coffee shop. For 36 months, while he begged me for survival capital, he has been secretly collecting $4,000 a month in commercial rent. He was double dipping. He was generating $7,500 in liquid capital every 30 days, untaxed by labor, while I drove a failing car and lived next to a freight train. The smear campaign collapsed in real time. The digital mob that had attacked me online was now sitting at the table holding the undeniable printed proof of their own manipulation. Aunt Susan looked up from the spreadsheet, her eyes wide, staring at Brenda with an expression of profound betrayal. Cousin Greg slowly pushed his plate away, his appetite entirely destroyed. Brenda realized the audience had turned. She deployed her final desperate tactic. The manufactured tears began to flow, cascading down her cheeks in a theatrical display of agony. She sobbed loudly, clutching a linen napkin to her face, waiting for the room to rush to her defense, waiting for someone to comfort her. But the room was cold. No one moved. No one offered a comforting hand. They were busy reading the forensic accounting of her deceit. You cannot cry your way out of a pivot table. I looked across the table at Harper. My younger sister was staring at the booklet, her hands trembling. She had remained completely silent, paralyzed by the exposure of her parents' fraud. My mother tried to cry, but as my sister was about to find out, the math was about to get even worse. The silence in the dining room was absolute, save for the ragged, performative sobs emanating from Brenda. 18 relatives sat immobilized, grappling with the sheer scale of the deception printed on the high-gloss paper in front of them. The narrative of the struggling, embattled patriarch had evaporated, replaced by the reality of a predatory extractor. I did not let the silence hold. The audit was not complete. I shifted my focus down the long table, bypassing the stunned faces of my aunts and cousins, and locked eyes with Harper. My sister sat rigidly in her high-backed chair. Her designer manicure gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She had received my text message days ago. She knew the family trust was a myth. She knew her boutique was funded by my stolen salary. But she believed she was merely the passive beneficiary of our parents' favoritism. She believed Thomas and Brenda had exploited me solely to provide for her. She did not know she was also a victim of the grift. "Turn to page 5, Harper," I instructed. The command cut through Brenda's weeping. Harper flinched. She looked down at the spiral-bound booklet resting next to her untouched turkey plate. Her hands shook as she flipped the heavy acrylic cover and turned the pages. 8 months ago, I said, addressing the entire table but keeping my eyes fixed on my sister, a single massive wire transfer was initiated from the joint account, $40,000. The memo line read, Harper Inventory. It was the capital injection required to secure the European imports for the grand reopening of Harper's Haven in Fayetteville. Harper stared at the row highlighted in aggressive neon red. The memory of her declined debit card, the humiliation of standing in front of her wholesale vendor without the funds she believed were her birthright, was clearly flashing across her face. I assumed I continued my voice steady, adopting the rhythm of a prosecutor, delivering the final piece of evidence, that Thomas and Brenda were simply funneling my salary directly into Harper's retail vanity project. I assumed they were subsidizing her lifestyle, while I subsidized theirs. But the logistics of that $40,000 transfer did not align with a simple retail purchase. I watched Uncle Rick turn the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. Aunt Susan leaned closer to him, reading over his shoulder. When you track a significant capital expenditure in supply chain management, I explained, you do not just verify the outbound wire. You verify the receiving vendor. You trace the endpoint of the asset. I pointed to the final column on page 5. Look at the destination routing information for that $40,000. It did not go to a European textile distributor. It did not go to an artisanal ceramics wholesaler in New York. Harper's eyes scanned across the page, following the line of data to the final column. The funds were wired to an entity named Ozark Holdings, LLC, I stated. The name hung in the air. It sounded official, corporate, and entirely disconnected from a high-end lifestyle boutique. Harper, I said, my voice softening slightly, not out of pity, but to ensure the impact of the revelation landed precisely. What did you use that $40,000 for?" Harper looked up. Her face was ashen, the pristine makeup unable to mask the sudden terror in her eyes. "The commercial lease," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Brenda's ongoing sobs. "The new storefront in Fayetteville required a massive upfront deposit, first, last, and a commercial security retainer. Mom told me the trust would cover the real estate acquisition." "And who held the commercial lease for that specific Fayetteville storefront?" I asked. Harper blinked. The heavy silver fork she had been nervously gripping slipped from her fingers. It clattered loudly against the fine china plate, a sharp, startling sound that caused several relatives to jump. Ozark Holdings, Harper answered, the realization dawning with brutal, crushing force. I nodded. I turned my gaze back to the head of the table. Ozark Holdings, LLC, I announced to the silent room, is a shell corporation registered in Pulaski County. The sole registered agent and primary beneficiary of that corporation is Thomas Johnson. The gasp that swept through the dining room was collective and visceral. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with her hand. Cousin Greg pushed his chair back, distancing himself from the table as if the furniture itself were contaminated. The ultimate plot twist was laid bare. Thomas had not given Harper $40,000. He had orchestrated a closed-loop money laundering operation. He convinced his favorite daughter to secure a commercial lease for a building he secretly owned through a shell corporation. Then he utilized my stolen salary to pay the exorbitant commercial deposit directly to himself. He double-dipped the extraction. He used the Golden Child as a conduit to funnel my wages into his own private real estate holding company. He was charging his own daughter rent, using her sister's money to pay the invoice, and pocketing the massive capital gain, while claiming to be on the verge of medical bankruptcy. The total dismantling of the abuser's alliance was complete. Harper stared at Thomas, the illusion of the benevolent patriarch, the man who supposedly cherished her above all else, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She realized she was not the prize. She was a pawn. She was a convenient, oblivious laundering mechanism for a deeply predatory grifter. The disgust in the room was palpable. It radiated from every relative seated at the table. The jury Brenda had assembled to execute my reputation had turned entirely against her. Uncle Rick took off his reading glasses and threw them onto the table. He looked at Thomas with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You stole from both of them," Rick said, his voice thick with revulsion. "You stole Lillian's salary, and you used Harper to hide the theft. You are a parasite, Thomas." Thomas's face transformed. The vein in his forehead throbbed violently, a thick blue cord standing out against his flushed skin. The pristine image he had cultivated for decades was obliterated. He could not deny the LLC registration. He could not deny the routing numbers. The forensic audit had stripped him of every defense, leaving him entirely exposed before the family he had sought to manipulate. His jaw locked, his hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists on the pristine linen tablecloth. A narcissist stripped of their narrative does not experience remorse. They experience rage. When the manipulation fails, the aggression becomes physical. He realized the social control was gone. He realized the financial pipeline was permanently severed. He realized the family he sought to weaponize against me was now looking at him with absolute disgust. My father was backed into a corner, and like a rat he lunged for the only weapon he thought he had left. The illusion of control evaporated, and Thomas shattered. A cornered predator does not engage in rational debate. When the ledger exposed his double-dipping, when the undeniable math stripped away his victimhood, he defaulted to primal territorial dominance. He could not refute the numbers printed on the high-gloss paper, so he attempted to seize the physical space. He stood up. The motion was so sudden, so devoid of his usual calculated grace, that his thighs caught the edge of the heavy dining table. Crystal water goblets tipped, spilling ice and liquid across the pristine white linen. His heavy wooden armchair tipped backward. It crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening, sharp crack that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Aunt Susan gasped, shrinking back into her seat. Cousin Greg froze, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Harper flinched, pulling her arms tight across her chest, staring wide-eyed at the man she had idolized for 28 years. Thomas ignored them all. He pointed a trembling, rigid finger directly at my face. His complexion shifted from flushed to a mottled, dangerous crimson. The veins in his neck stood out like rigid cords. "You smug, ungrateful tyrant," Thomas roared, his voice bouncing off the dining room walls, rattling the fine china stacked in the corner cabinet. "You think you can walk in here with your spreadsheets and dictate terms to me? You think you can humiliate me in front of my own family?" I remained seated. I did not flinch. I let his volume wash over me, recognizing it for what it truly was. It was not power. It was the desperate, noisy death rattle of his authority. "I built this family," he shouted, slamming his fist down onto the table. The silverware jumped. "I provided the roof over your head. You owe your entire arrogant corporate existence to my sacrifices, and you dare come into my dining room to play the victim? You dare accuse me of theft in my own home?" He took a deep breath, his chest heaving, preparing to deliver his ultimate ultimatum. He was reaching for the final weapon in his arsenal, the ultimate threat he believed would force my submission. "Get out," he commanded, his voice dripping with venom. He pointed toward the front door. "Take your papers and your arrogant husband and get off my property. You are no longer welcome here. This is my house and you will leave it right now." The dining room descended into a suffocating, terrified stillness. The 18 relatives held their breath. Brenda ceased her performative sobbing, looking up with a glimmer of dark hope, waiting for me to crumble under the sheer force of patriarchal banishment. They expected me to stand, to gather my canvas tote bag, and to retreat into the freezing November night. They expected the threat of exile to break my resolve. I did not move. Instead, a chair scraped softly against the floorboards near the center of the table. Great Aunt Clara stood up. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a monarch ascending a dais. She smoothed the front of her tailored wool blazer. She picked up her heavy, structured leather purse from the floor beside her feet. She did not look at Thomas with fear. She looked at him with the cold, detached, profound disappointment of an auditor reviewing a failed asset. "Sit down," Thomas Clara said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It possessed a dry, gravelly authority that cut through the lingering echoes of his shouting like a steel blade. Thomas blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden intervention. "Aunt Clara, this is none of your business. This is between me and my disrespectful daughter." "This is entirely my business," Clara replied, unfastening the brass clasp of her purse. "Because your daughter is the only person at this table possessing a shred of moral and financial integrity. You, on the other hand, are a parasite who has finally exhausted his host." Clara reached into the dark interior of her handbag. She withdrew a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. She unwound the red string securing the flap and pulled out a stack of dense official documents. On top of the stack was the original yellowed 1990 trust deed I had extracted from the cedar chest, which I had securely handed over to her before the dinner commenced. Appended to it were fresh, newly notarized administrative filings bearing the seal of the state of Arkansas. Clara held the papers aloft for a brief second, then she let them drop. The heavy stack of legal parchment hit the solid oak table with a dull, definitive thud. The sound was not loud, but the impact was seismic. 18 relatives stared at the yellowed paper. "You just told Lillian to get out of your house," Clara stated, her eyes locking onto Thomas, stripping him bare. "That is a fascinating command, considering you do not own a single brick of this foundation." Thomas's jaw dropped. The mottled crimson drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid gray. The aggressive posture dissolved, replaced by a sudden, hollow terror. He recognized the yellowed paper. He knew exactly what Clara had placed on the table. Margaret was a wise woman, Clara addressed the silent room, her tone shifting to an icy formal exposition. "My sister knew her son was allergic to honest labor. She knew that if she left this estate to him directly, he would leverage it, mortgage it, and eventually squander it to fund his own leisure. So 12 years ago, she established a generational trust. She deeded this property to me, naming me the sole administrative executor." Aunt Susan gasped again, her eyes darting between Clara and the pale, shaking form of her brother. "I allowed you to reside here, Thomas," Clara continued, her words precise and lethal. "I allowed you to occupy this home rent-free, but Margaret attached a singular, non-negotiable stipulation to your residency. The trust explicitly stated that you were permitted to live here only as long as you maintained and operated the family hardware store as a solvent retail enterprise. Clara pointed a long, age-spotted finger at the forensic spreadsheets scattered across the table. Lillian's audit is flawless, Clara announced. You closed the retail hardware store 3 years ago. You liquidated the remaining inventory. You leased the building to a commercial coffee shop to line your own pockets, and you hid that revenue stream while bleeding your oldest daughter dry. The silence of the 18 relatives was absolute. No one chewed. No one breathed. The scale of his defeat was comprehensive. The moment you shuttered that hardware store and executed the commercial lease in Eureka Springs, you violated the core condition of Margaret's trust, Clara declared, delivering the final legal strike. You breached your fiduciary duty. You nullified your right to residency. You have been living here as a squatter for 36 months. Brenda let out a short, high-pitched wail. She clutched her napkin and her eyes wide with genuine panic. The social shield was gone, the financial shield was gone, and now the roof over her head was evaporating. I am 82 years old, Clara said, gathering her leather purse and sliding the strap over her shoulder. I do not have the patience to manage a delinquent tenant. Therefore, this morning I executed a legal transfer of administrative authority. Clara looked at me. A rare, fierce smile touched the corners of her mouth. Effective immediately, Clara proclaimed to the room. The sole trustee, the legal administrator, and the rightful owner of this estate is Lillian Johnson. Thomas staggered backward. He bumped against the wall, his hands grasping the wainscoting for support. His eyes darted around the dining room, searching for an ally, searching for a gap in the logic. There was none. The legal bluff was met with a legal checkmate. His patriarchal intimidation was entirely dismantled by hyper-competence and undeniable documentation. I reached down into my canvas tote bag. I did not retrieve another spreadsheet. I pulled out a single crisp white folder. I stood up from my chair. The heavy formal navy dress rustled as I moved. I walked to the head of the table. Thomas shrank back, unable to meet my gaze. I placed the white folder on the table, directly in front of him. I flipped it open. Inside was a standard Arkansas residential lease agreement. I had drafted it the night before, utilizing the precise market value data for their specific zip code. The monthly rent is $2,800, I stated, my voice echoing in the silent room, cool and unyielding, plus utilities, payable on the 1st of every month. The security deposit is due by Monday. If the funds do not clear, I will initiate formal eviction proceedings on Tuesday. I looked at the man who had stolen my 20s, the man who had skipped my wedding, the man who had just attempted to banish me into the cold. My father told me to get out of his house, so I handed him a lease agreement for mine. A year has passed since the Thanksgiving dinner. The Arkansas autumn has returned, bringing the crisp, cool air that signals the turning of the season. The oppressive heat of the summer is gone, replaced by a sharp clarity that makes the horizon look vast and unbroken. I stand in the doorway of the spare bedroom in my apartment. It is no longer a cramped home office cluttered with supply chain manifests and anxiety. David and I painted the walls a soft, warm sage green. A wooden crib sits near the window, waiting for the arrival of our daughter in the spring. Draped carefully over the back of a maple rocking chair is my grandmother's hand-stitched wedding ring quilt. It is safe. It is clean. It holds no hidden deeds anymore, only the physical memory of a woman who saw the truth and ensured I would eventually see it too. I reach into my pocket and pull out my phone. Today is the 1st of November. I open my banking application. I do not feel the familiar tightening knot of terror in my chest. For 6 years, the 1st of the month brought a wave of nausea, the sickening reality of my labor migrating out of my possession to fund the illusions of my abusers. The biometric scan clears and the ledger loads on the screen. The outgoing recurring transfers section is entirely blank. 0 active mandates. The balance in my primary savings account is robust growing, with a steady compounding momentum. My student loans are eradicated. The vehicle with the rattling transmission was traded in for a reliable, safe SUV. David and I are closing on a property of our own next month, a beautiful home sitting on 3 acres of quiet timberland. I lock the screen and place the phone on the windowsill. It does not vibrate, it does not ring with frantic demands or manufactured medical emergencies. The silence in the room is profound, deep, and luxurious. The structural collapse of the Johnson family facade was neither swift nor graceful. It was a slow, agonizing descent into the reality of the American working class. When you remove the artificial margin, gravity asserts control. Harper was the first to fall. Stripped of the stolen capital, the shell corporation managed by my father could no longer float her retail vanity project. Her vendors filed default notices. She was evicted from the Fayetteville storefront within 60 days. The neon sign was repossessed. The European imports were seized by creditors to settle the outstanding invoices. She currently resides in a cramped apartment shared with 2 roommates. She works 38 hours a week folding distressed denim at a mid-tier retail chain in the local mall. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day managing difficult customers and strict shift supervisors who do not care about her online aesthetic. She does not post live streams anymore. The golden child was forced to trade the pedestal for a time clock. We do not speak, but the cousins occasionally update the group chat. They report she looks exhausted. I know she looks like an adult finally learning the actual cost of her own lifestyle. Thomas and Brenda experienced a far more humiliating descent. Faced with the immediate threat of eviction and possessing 0 liquid savings, they signed the residential lease agreement. They are now legally bound tenants of my property management firm. To cover the $2,800 monthly rent plus utilities, Thomas had to abandon the country club. He had to sell the boat docked at Beaver Lake. The commercial rent he hoarded from the Eureka Springs coffee shop is immediately transferred to my corporate account to cover their housing debt. But that revenue stream was not enough to sustain their grocery bills, the property taxes, and Brenda's shopping habits. Thomas was forced to enter the labor market at age 61. He currently works the early morning shift at a regional home improvement warehouse. He wears an orange apron. He operates a forklift and loads bags of concrete into the back of pickup trucks for local contractors. The man who faked a knee injury to steal $250,000 now spends his days lifting physical weight. The toll is real. His hands are calloused. The pristine fishing shirts were sold online to cover a utility invoice. Brenda was forced to cancel her premium cable package and clip coupons. She shops at discount grocers. The weaponized incompetence she wielded for decades was instantly cured by the sheer necessity of survival. When you remove the safety net, people miraculously learn how to walk the tightrope. They pay the rent promptly on the 1st of every month. The funds arrive in my corporate ledger via a certified electronic transfer. I do not send thank you notes. I do not issue receipts. I act as the administrator of the asset, enforcing the boundaries of the contract with corporate precision. They attempted to test the boundaries, once calling David in March to ask for a 2-week extension on the rent due to a minor car repair. I instructed my attorney to mail them a standard notice to quit. The rent was paid in full the next morning. They never asked for an extension again. The extended family dynamic shifted entirely. Aunt Susan mailed me a handwritten letter of apology in January. Cousin Greg routinely likes my posts online. The relatives who rushed to condemn me on social media now direct their quiet, polite disdain toward the true architects of the fraud. But I do not engage with their apologies. The validation of the extended family was another false metric I chased for far too long. I do not require their approval. I possess the ledger. I sit in the rocking chair in the nursery. I run my hand over the soft, faded cotton of the quilt. I spent my 20s living in a state of perpetual terror, convinced that if I failed to produce the necessary capital, my family would perish. I believed my value was inextricably linked to my utility. I confused extortion with affection. When they left the front row of my wedding chapel empty, they thought they were punishing me. They thought they were sending a message about my place in the hierarchy. They did not realize they were handing me the key to my own cage. The love they offered was a transactional illusion. It was a subscription service, and the moment the credit card declined, the service was terminated. The people who genuinely care for your well-being do not require a monthly retainer. The people who cherish your presence do not charge you a premium to occupy a seat in their lives. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only functional adult in a room full of emotional toddlers. If you are listening to this and you recognize that exhaustion in your own bones, you know exactly what I am talking about. You know the weight of the expectations. You know the fear of the phone ringing late at night. You know the exact cost of the margin you surrender to keep the peace. You have calculated the math in the dark, wondering how much longer you can sustain the output before the foundation cracks. Do not wait for the foundation to crack. Do not wait for them to skip your milestones or celebrate their vanity projects with your stolen wages. The guilt they weaponize against you is not real. It is a control mechanism designed to keep the supply line open. Open your bank statements, audit your emotional expenditures, trace the destination of your labor. If the ledger reveals a one-way extraction, you must find the courage to turn off the faucet. The resulting confrontation will be loud. The smear campaigns will be vicious. They will summon audiences to execute your reputation. Let them scream. Let them post their fabricated tragedies. You cannot scream at a closed vault. The peace that follows the storm is profound. The silence of a phone that no longer rings with manufactured emergencies is the most luxurious asset you will ever acquire. For 72 months, I bought their survival, but the silence I bought on my wedding day, that was priceless. If you are the load-bearing wall, walk out. Let the roof fall. The architecture of the traditional American family is often idealized as a sanctuary. We are taught from a very young age that the home is a fortress of unconditional support, a place where the foundation is built on mutual respect, generational progress, and unwavering loyalty. Parents are supposed to be the architects of this sanctuary, guiding their children with a steady hand, preparing them to enter the world as capable, independent adults. But what happens when the architects decide they no longer want to build? What happens when they decide instead to quietly dismantle the foundation and use the timber to keep their own fires burning? The story of Lillian Johnson and the empty chairs at her wedding and the $250,000 extracted from her loyalty is not just a narrative about financial fraud. It is a profound, terrifying reflection on the collapse of parenting values and the perversion of family responsibility. When we look closely at Thomas and Brenda, we do not just see grifters, we see a catastrophic failure of emotional awareness. In a healthy family structure, a parent recognizes the individual humanity of their children. They raise them with fairness, understanding that each child requires guidance, boundaries, and most importantly, the freedom to build their own lives. Thomas and Brenda did not view their daughters as individuals. They viewed them as utilities. They created a toxic dichotomy that is tragically common in households lacking emotional integrity: the golden child and the load-bearing wall. Harper was raised to be the ornament. She was shielded from the friction of reality, handed a credit card funded by invisible labor, and praised simply for existing. On the surface, it looks as though she was the favored daughter, but true parental guidance requires the imposition of consequence. By insulating Harper from the actual cost of living, Thomas and Brenda crippled her. They raised an adult who shattered the moment the artificial margin was removed. They did not prepare her for the world. They prepared her for a counterfeit reality that was always destined to collapse. Lillian, conversely, was groomed for servitude. Her competence, her reliability, and her deep sense of familial duty were identified early on, not as virtues to be celebrated, but as resources to be mined. The American dream is fundamentally built on the idea of generational sacrifice, parents working hard so their children can have a better life. Thomas and Brenda inverted this sacred contract. They demanded their child sacrifice her youth, her financial security, and her peace of mind so they could maintain a facade of wealth they had not earned. This inversion relies entirely on the weaponization of gratitude. We fed you, we clothed you, we put a roof over your head. These are the refrains of parents who view basic legal obligations as a ledger of debt their children must repay. But true family responsibility is not alone with an accruing interest rate. Providing food and shelter to a child you chose to bring into the world does not entitle you to their adult paycheck. A parent who demands repayment for a childhood has fundamentally misunderstood the assignment of parenthood. Honesty and fairness are the bedrock of any lasting relationship, but they are absolutely critical in raising children. When parents lie to their children, whether it is a lie about a failing hardware store, a fictional generational trust, or the true nature of an emergency, they sever the psychological safety of the home. They teach their children that reality is malleable, that truth is whatever serves the immediate needs of the patriarch or matriarch. Lillian spent 6 years living in a manufactured state of terror, believing her family was on the brink of ruin. She was manipulated through her own empathy. That is not parenting. That is a hostage situation disguised as a household. Breaking free from this dynamic requires a monumental act of courage. It requires the victim to look at the people who gave them life and recognize that those same people are actively consuming it. It requires the cold, hard realization that the empty chairs at a wedding are not a mistake, but a message. It takes a specific kind of strength to stop trying to buy the love of people who are only interested in billing you.